Something unthinkable is happening inside Russia. As refineries burn, the ruble collapses and protests spread across major cities, the Kremlin has just announced perhaps the most absurd project in modern history, a $1 trillion tunnel to Alaska. The world watches in disbelief as Vladimir Putin's government, cornered by war and sanctions, proposes to literally dig its way out of isolation. According to Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special representative and head of the Russian direct investment fund Moscow is conducting a feasibility study to connect Asia and North America through a massive tunnel beneath the Bering Strait. On paper, the plan sounds visionary, a grand bridge between continents, but in reality it is nothing less than a symbol of a regime losing touch with reality. The announcement comes at a time when Russia's internal fractures have reached their peak. Political elites are divided, the middle class is vanishing, and ordinary citizens are paying the ultimate price for the war in Ukraine. Prices of basic goods have soared, fuel shortages have paralyzed transportation, and entire regions are facing blackouts. Yet instead of addressing these urgent crises, the Kremlin dreams of linking Russia to America, its declared enemy, through an impossible mega-project that would take decades and trillions of dollars to complete. To put it into perspective, the Bering Strait is nearly 100 kilometers wide, frozen most of the year, and shaken by frequent earthquakes. Engineers say such a tunnel would make the Channel Tunnel between Britain and France look like a toy. Even under ideal conditions, construction would require 20 to 30 years, with costs surpassing half of Russia's current GDP. In a nation where people queue for gasoline and hospitals lack medicine, such a fantasy borders on the grotesque. But what makes this story even more surreal is that President Donald Trump himself expressed curiosity about the idea, calling it an interesting concept worth discussion. That brief comment instantly turned a Kremlin daydream into an international headline and fueled speculation about whether this was a genuine plan or a desperate distraction. Behind the scenes, the purpose seems clear. While Russians struggle for survival, Putin's regime is trying to shift attention from the crumbling front lines and the collapsing economy. The promise of a tunnel of peace between Alaska and Siberia is not an engineering vision. It is psychological warfare aimed at the Russian people. And as this illusion is sold to the masses, voices of dissent begin to rise across the country. For the first time in 2 decades, local councils and journalists are openly demanding Putin's resignation, calling the tunnel a mad dream of a dying empire. But what triggered this explosion of anger? What made loyal supporters suddenly turn against their own leader? That answer lies in the devastating reality unfolding inside Russia, the empty shelves, the silent gas stations, and the growing realization that the Kremlin's power may be running on fumes. By October 2025, Russia's once mighty economy was suffocating. As the war dragged on, the sanctions imposed by the West, especially against Rosneft and Lukoil, the 2 energy pillars of the nation, began to cripple every sector of daily life. For years, the Kremlin had promised stability and strength. Now that illusion was gone. Fuel prices doubled within weeks, supermarket shelves stood half empty, and millions of Russians found themselves queuing for basic necessities. It was no longer a distant geopolitical problem fought at the front. It had reached every kitchen table, every gas station, every pensioner's heart. 84% of the country was facing fuel shortages, the worst in modern Russian history. Rural towns were cut off, buses stopped running, and factories stood silent. The patience of ordinary people was breaking, and for the first time, anger was louder than fear. Independent analysts from the Journal of Democracy revealed that 57% of citizens now supported peace talks with Ukraine. Only 35% still wanted to continue the war. The numbers were staggering. Even loyal state journalists like Dmitry Shechin of Komsomolskaya Pravda began warning publicly that the regime risked collapse if the people's suffering continued. Inside Moscow and St. Petersburg, dozens of local council members signed petitions demanding Putin's resignation, something unthinkable just a year earlier. The most dramatic act of defiance came from the Smolenskoye District Council in St. Petersburg. Their councillors officially requested that the State Duma remove Vladimir Putin from office on charges of treason. Their argument was precise, legalistic, and devastating. Putin had destroyed the army, created a demographic catastrophe, collapsed the economy, and led Russia to strategic defeat. They knew this move would never succeed in Parliament. The goal was not victory, it was to light a spark. And it worked. The call for change began spreading beyond Moscow's elite circles to the regions that had paid the highest price for war: Siberia, the Urals, and the industrial heartland. In those places where young men had been drafted and never returned, where wages evaporated with inflation, the Kremlin's propaganda began to lose its grip. At the same time, Ukraine's asymmetric warfare was delivering crippling blows to Russia's energy backbone. Since early 2024, swarms of low-cost Ukrainian drones had targeted oil refineries deep inside Russian territory. Facilities worth billions were being reduced to smoking ruins by drones costing only a few $1,000s each. These attacks not only drained the war budget, but also exposed Russia's vulnerability, a superpower unable to defend its own infrastructure. When the Orenburg gas facility erupted in flames, the shockwave was felt far beyond Russia's borders. The massive complex, one of the largest in the world, was essential for domestic consumption and exports to Central Asia. The fire crippled production and cut off the SYU pipeline to Kazakhstan, forcing that country to halt gas imports from Russia and turn toward China. With every strike, Russia's geopolitical isolation deepened. Its once dominant energy empire, the same empire funding Putin's power, was collapsing. And yet, while cities froze and industry stalled, the Kremlin's answer was not to rebuild, but to dream of a tunnel under the Arctic ice. So the question echoed across a weary nation: how can a government unable to deliver water to Donetsk or fuel to Moscow possibly build a bridge to Alaska? The deeper the war dragged on, the more fragile Russia became. By mid-October 2025, the unthinkable had happened. The country that once supplied oil and gas to half the world could barely fuel itself. Across 84% of the Federation, fuel shortages reached catastrophic levels. From the snow-covered streets of St. Petersburg to the vast industrial fields of Siberia, gas stations ran dry, trucks stopped moving, and supply chains collapsed. The crisis hit every corner of life. Trains transporting grain to southern regions were halted. Hospitals ran on emergency generators that sputtered and failed. Food distribution slowed to a crawl, leaving supermarket shelves empty. In rural areas, farmers abandoned their tractors. There was no diesel left to harvest the fields. The once proud Russian energy network, the symbol of national power, had turned into a maze of silent pipelines and idle refineries. The most destructive blow came from the Ukrainian drone attacks that tore through Russia's vital energy arteries. In Orenburg, one of the largest natural gas processing plants in the world was reduced to ashes. Flames reached high into the Arctic night sky, visible for miles. The explosion halted gas exports to Central Asia and crippled domestic supply. Almost simultaneously, another strike hit the Novo-Kuybyshev refinery in Samara Oblast, a crucial hub that fueled central Russia and the frontline operations in Ukraine. Within hours, production plunged and regional fuel distribution collapsed entirely. These weren't just isolated incidents. They marked a coordinated campaign, Ukraine's strategy to paralyze Russia from within. Using cheap, agile drones, Kyiv was striking billion-dollar infrastructure targets and forcing Moscow to spend hundreds of millions on emergency repairs. According to Defense News and Reuters, the economic loss from these strikes had already exceeded tens of billions of dollars, not counting the long-term impact on exports. As winter approached, the situation became dire. Reports described scenes of chaos at fuel stations, fights breaking out among drivers, long lines of desperate citizens waiting for hours only to be turned away. In many regions, even the military faced shortages. Tanks and armored vehicles stood immobilized, unable to move to the front. Commanders resorted to rationing fuel, prioritizing defense of key cities while abandoning smaller units. And amid this chaos, frustration erupted. Ordinary Russians, factory workers, pensioners, mothers began to speak openly about the regime's failure. On social media, videos spread showing citizens shouting at local officials demanding answers. The once powerful state propaganda machine could no longer hide the truth. Even loyal voices on state TV were forced to admit that the temporary disruptions were now a national emergency. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, the leadership turned its eyes away from the chaos. Instead of confronting the reality of a collapsing energy grid, the government clung to fantasy, boasting about the future Alaska Tunnel, a project of peace that would unite continents. For the struggling population, it was an insult. The Kremlin couldn't provide gas to heat their homes, yet spoke of building bridges to America. To many, the symbolism was clear. While the nation burned, its rulers dreamed of escape. And the more the fires spread across Russia's refineries, the more people began to ask the question no one had dared utter before: is Putin's Russia finally reaching its breaking point? As Russia's fuel crisis deepened, another scandal erupted, one that symbolized the sheer decay of Putin's state. For 10 long years, the Kremlin had promised to deliver clean water to the city of Donetsk, a territory it claimed to have liberated and annexed. Yet in 2 decades of war and occupation, Moscow had failed to build even a single reliable pipeline from Rostov-on-Don, just a few hundred kilometers away. The result was a humanitarian disaster, millions of residents living with hourly water rations, polluted wells, and crumbling infrastructure. The contrast was staggering. On one hand, Putin's officials boasted about constructing a $1 trillion tunnel under the Bering Strait. On the other, they could not provide drinking water to their own citizens within Russian-controlled territory. Every promise turned into another empty headline. Projects were announced, foundations laid, and funds mysteriously disappeared into the black hole of corruption. By 2025, the Donetsk water pipeline had become a symbol of everything wrong with the regime: incompetence, greed, and propaganda replacing real governance. As investigative journalists reported on, the ground construction sites were abandoned. Rusting pipes lay scattered across empty fields, guarded by unpaid workers. Local residents, once hopeful, now referred to the Kremlin's pledges as ghost projects. The message was clear: if Moscow couldn't deliver water to Donetsk, how could it ever build a 100-kilometer tunnel under the Arctic ice? This failure didn't just expose technical weakness, it exposed a moral collapse. While citizens queued for fuel and water, the Kremlin invested in spectacles designed to distract from the nation's decay. Officials spoke of global connectivity and engineering miracles, hoping to rekindle the pride of a weary people. But to many Russians, these grand words sounded like a cruel joke. The so-called tunnel to Alaska became a metaphor for escapism, a dream sold to a population drowning in hardship. Political analysts from Deutsche Welle and BBC News described it as a fantasy of salvation, a psychological operation to maintain control amid chaos. By promising a future of intercontinental glory, the regime sought to hide its inability to manage the present. It was an old Soviet trick: when reality turns unbearable, distract the masses with utopian promises. But behind the fantasy lay a darker possibility. Some experts speculated that the tunnel was not just a propaganda stunt, it was a personal escape plan. A secret path for the Kremlin's elite should Russia collapse completely. A route from Siberia to Alaska, from isolation to safety. The speculation went viral online, sparking both ridicule and fear. Could it be that the same men who drove Russia into ruin were now designing their way out of it? Whatever the truth, the symbolism could not be ignored. History was repeating itself, leaders dreaming of grand monuments while their nations fell apart. Just like the Roman Emperor Nero, who played music while Rome burned, Putin's circle seemed lost in delusion. As fires raged across refineries and protests spread in the streets, the regime clung to fantasies instead of solutions. But if water and fuel were gone, what remained to keep this empire standing? What could possibly sustain a state that no longer feeds or protects its own people? Inside the Kremlin's golden corridors, a strange illusion has taken hold. Surrounded by loyalists and yes-men, Putin now rules over an empire of silence, a world where truth no longer reaches the throne. Every day his advisors bring him reports carefully polished to please statistics, rewritten to flatter, and applause manufactured to echo through the empty halls of power. It is here, amid this echo chamber, that the fantasy of the Alaska Tunnel was born, not as a plan for progress, but as a monument to denial. According to analysts from Reuters and Defense News, this project is less about engineering and more about survival. Unable to offer solutions for the crumbling economy, the regime resorts to spectacle, the illusion of a grand future, to cover the decay of the present. The promise of connecting Asia and America serves as a distraction from the burning reality: a nation whose refineries are destroyed, whose army bleeds on the battlefield, and whose citizens line up for food and fuel. Inside this illusion, Putin still imagines Russia as a rising superpower uniting continents through its might. But outside the Kremlin walls, the truth is merciless. Hospitals lack medicine schools, close for lack of heating, and young men return from the front in coffins. The propaganda speaks of global glory, yet the people see only ashes. This dissonance between vision and reality has become the defining feature of the Putin era. History shows that every autocracy in its dying days begins to dream grander. Egypt's pharaohs built pyramids as their kingdoms crumbled, the Soviets promised a communist utopia as breadlines grew, and now the Kremlin dreams of a tunnel to America while its people drown in poverty. Even foreign observers no longer take Moscow's boasts seriously. Western experts mock the project as a tunnel from delusion to despair. Chinese officials, once eager partners, have grown distant, demanding hard cash instead of promises. And within Russia, whispers grow louder. If the leader can imagine escaping through the Bering Strait, perhaps he already knows the end is near. For those close to the regime, fear has replaced faith. Many oligarchs have quietly moved their assets abroad, buying properties in Dubai, Turkey, and Cyprus. The intelligence services, once Putin's backbone, are now divided, some still loyal, others silently preparing for what comes after. The machinery of power still functions, but it grinds slower, heavier, and with visible cracks. Meanwhile, Russia's propaganda machine works harder than ever. State TV fills the airwaves with patriotic songs, promises of victory, and the dream of a new Russia that will connect continents. Yet even the most devoted viewers feel the fatigue. The illusion is breaking. For every image of the Alaska Tunnel, there are 10 videos online of burning refineries, broken roads, and desperate families. And so the question arises, when the lies no longer work, what remains to hold an empire together? Fear can only last so long before it turns inward. History is merciless to rulers who mistake illusion for power. As the Kremlin sinks deeper into isolation, Putin's empire is beginning to resemble a house built on smoke and mirrors. Beneath the patriotic songs and televised parades lies a reality too dark to hide. Russia's collapse is already underway, not with explosions in the streets, but in the quiet, invisible decay of its institutions. The signs are everywhere. The army is starved of supplies. The treasury bleeds from endless sanctions. Local governments no longer obey orders from Moscow. The so-called strong state is hollowing from within. Autocratic regimes rarely fall in one dramatic moment. They rot slowly until they suddenly crumble. And that is what Russia is experiencing today, a slow-motion collapse. Analysts from BBC and Deutsche Welle describe it as systemic paralysis, the point where the state still exists on paper but can no longer perform its basic duties. Roads remain unrepaired, teachers go unpaid, and hospitals rely on charity. In the countryside, power outages last for days, while in the cities, people stand in silence before empty gas stations. Meanwhile, the Kremlin clings to its delusions. Putin's speeches grow more disconnected, filled with promises of historic destiny and global unity. His advisors speak of the Alaska Tunnel as if it were the new symbol of rebirth, a project that will redefine humanity. But to the outside world, it looks like the desperate fantasy of a ruler who has lost control of the present. The irony is brutal. While Moscow dreams of bridging continents, it cannot even bridge the gap between its leaders and its people. Each new promise sounds emptier than the last. The tunnel, once announced as a vision of power, has become a metaphor for escape, a corridor leading nowhere. Across the nation, the discontent deepens. Families mourn, sons lost in Ukraine. Workers line up for food vouchers. Pensioners who once survived Soviet hardships now whisper that this time feels worse. For the first time in 2 decades, even Putin's most loyal supporters are beginning to question whether he still knows what he is doing. The myth of the invincible leader is fading, replaced by something far more dangerous: disbelief. The world has seen this pattern before. When leaders lose touch with reality, when propaganda replaces governance, collapse becomes inevitable. The only uncertainty is how it will happen: through a military defeat, an internal uprising, or the quiet suffocation of a state that simply stops working. And so, as fires burn across refineries and the Kremlin speaks of tunnels to America, one question echoes louder than all others. Is Russia building its future or burying it beneath the ice of the Bering Strait? The story unfolding in Russia today is not just about one leader or one failed project. It is a warning written in real time. A nation once feared across the globe now finds itself paralyzed by its own contradictions. While the Kremlin dreams of connecting continents, ordinary Russians are struggling to connect their next meal, their next paycheck, their next winter without fuel. The Alaska Tunnel stands as the perfect symbol of this delusion, a fantasy of escape for an elite that can no longer face its people. But history never allows such illusions to last. Every empire that loses touch with reality eventually confronts its truth. The Soviet Union fell not with gunfire but with silence, the silence of a people who stopped believing. That silence is returning. Every new speech from Moscow sounds more distant. Every new promise rings hollower. For those watching abroad, this is the moment to reflect on what happens when power becomes detached from responsibility, when propaganda replaces purpose and ambition replaces reason. The Bering Strait tunnel may never be built, but its idea already tells the story of a regime running out of time. So what do you think? Is this the beginning of Russia's final unraveling, or just another act in the theatre of survival? Share your thoughts below, subscribe for more in-depth reports, and stay with us as we follow how this story unfolds, one that could reshape the balance of the modern world.